So then we then kind of had this guy called international trade. What happens when we open up the economy? So it's kind of a bit of an extension of the government intervention chapter, but more in an open setting, right? That's kind of the way that we wanted you to think about it. So we imposed a number of assumptions. The first being it's a small open economy and there are price takers, okay, takers. And we then needed to then talk about other trade policies that would result in deadweight losses, okay? So to do this, we then needed to talk about domestic price. That is the price that would prevail if there was no world trade. A world price, which is the equilibrium price on the world market, and that's usually the price that we take as given a small open economy. So a small open economy is one where we're too small to influence prices, and then we talked about gains from trade, okay? The two policies that we then talked about were import tariffs and import quotas. So a tariff is a per unit tax on imported goods, right? So you can see the sort of parallel to the taxes that we talked about in the previous chapter. An import quota, right, was basically a limit in terms of the quantity you're allowed to import, right? So there's no real parallel to that in terms of government intervention, but in many ways, one of the pitfalls which I noticed that you guys sort of got a little bit confused with is that it kind of shifts the supply curve. Well, no, it really doesn't shift the supply curve unless you're going to argue that you suddenly allow import and you sort of then impose a quota. But what the quota does is that it basically, when we talk about this thing here, so you have S and S plus quota, right? Most of you interpret that as a shift, right? But this is actually not a shift, right? It's just simply a representation of what the domestic market is, right? That is what domestic supply is. This is what supply is once you actually have the quota. There's no actual shift, right? So be very, very careful, right? And that's why I pulled a few of you up on that, okay? What's actually shifting? The point is there is no shift, right? It's a representation, okay? So the key thing to note was that in this particular chapter, once you open up the economy, and if you didn't have any government intervention, right, you would actually find that the economy will benefit, okay? So again, if we draw this very simple diagram, P, Q, this, S, D, and suppose this was the world price, right? What would basically happen if you left it to the domestic markets? This would be your economic surplus, this being your CS, this being your PS, right? But what happens when you allow for trade? Well, this would then be the prevailing price, PW, right? This will then be your new consumer surplus. But what's your producer surplus? It's basically this large triangle here. So the result is more economic surplus. And you guys say, well, the consumers are now worse off. But again, if you go through my argument of a Pareto improving transaction, that is you can make transfer payment, then actually you can actually make everyone else better off, okay? Or the consumers equally well off, okay? So that was kind of the point. Trade is a good thing, okay? But as a result, if you tried to then talk about tariffs and quotas, you invariably would create a deadweight loss, okay? And that is relative to the free trade equilibrium, right? Where you actually allow no intervention, okay? So in the case of a tariff, most of you will probably realize, hopefully this diagram is familiar, you have PW here, okay? You'd say, well, okay, if we have a tariff that lifted up here, so PW plus T, right? Consumer surplus had kind of shrunk, okay, by this much. Producers had increased this much in terms of producer surplus. The revenue that we earn in terms of tariff is whatever is the import multiplied by the tariff, which is the height of this thing here. So this guy here is my tariff revenue. And then we had these sort of deadweight losses. Okay? And again, I wanted to probe you. What do these deadweight losses represent? This is lost consumption. This particular area here, right, is lost consumption as a result of the tariff. This part here is in effect a production loss. That is, they are producers that have been allocated to produce this particular good due to the use of the tariff. So, in other words, they could have been more efficient if they had gone and produced something else, right? So in some ways, this is an additional cost to the economy that really shouldn't have occurred, right? Or should have been allocated elsewhere, okay? The analysis for the quota was very, very similar, okay? So the quota was basically S plus Q, D, okay, and then you'd have a world price, okay. So this would be then remember this was then the prevailing domestic price, right? And this is the world price, and you could basically say, well, again, right, consumer surplus has shrunk, producer surplus has basically grown, okay. And you could then say, so producer surplus has grown from here, has grown by that much, and then you get your triangles here. And remember, you guys then kind of said that this was your quota revenue. Well, not really quota revenue. In some cases, it could have been Japanese profits, for those that recall, but it is surplus to the importers, basically. And again, you'd have these two deadweight losses. Okay? And the interpretation of these two deadweight losses is fairly similar to the tariff interpretation. Okay? And some of you, and the question which I then posed was then, well, why is it better for example, a government to benefit relative to a producer? So this was a question which really kind of really required you to think a little bit further, right? If the producers, right, were to benefit, what are they going to do with it? If the government actually benefited, what would it do with it? So the case for the government to really actually benefit is for them to be able to use that fund to fund, for example, public goods, right? That's what I wanted you to get at. Rather than talk about redistribution of wealth and all that type of thing, the essence of it is if you think about the later chapters, right, there is a case for government intervention. And I wanted you to draw that link as to why the government benefiting may be a better outcome. And that would be the argument that you would then make, right? The case for producers would be, well, if you give it to the government and the government is not efficient, a lot of that resources is going to be wasted anyway. Whereas if you give it to other firms, they may be able to reinvest into the economy and then increase employment or whatnot, right? So that was kind of the flavor which I wanted to sort of instill in all of you. So again, think outside the box and make a coherent economic argument as to why certain outcomes are preferred, okay? So basically, henceforth, we then said, okay, let's relax some of these assumptions. So I'm going to take a break, Sam.